Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sasha Farbach. It is welcome that the Kremlin has publicly agreed to this approach. The Élysée Palace in Paris said after President Macron suggested Europe should re-engage with Russia. Yet while Macron seeks dialogue in Paris, Berlin is stepping into the EU spotlight as well. Moscow remains cautious, dismissing any new trilateral negotiations with Washington and Kyiv. Now, to break it down and what this means for Ukraine, Europe, and global diplomacy, we're now joined by Bohdan Nahaylo, editor-in-chief of the Kyiv Post. Good to have you back on TVP World.
Good morning.
Let's start with this news out of Paris, this statement here. What do we make of it? Because I mean, it was Macron at the end of the day, years back, who was meeting Putin. He still had that call. The last sort of to pull out of contact. What do you make of his statement here? What does it mean ultimately for dialogue with the West and Russia?
Well, I think it's good that Macron is also applying some form of gentle pressure, in this case, on Moscow. There are several factors, I think, here. First, that Europe has galvanized itself. It's been taking part in the talks in Miami this weekend. Most importantly, last week in Berlin, it showed strong support for Ukraine in the agreements that were reached on supporting Ukraine militarily and later in the week financially with this huge loan over 2 years that Ukraine's going to get. Obviously, that sent shudders into Moscow, which does not appreciate Europe standing up so firmly. It's doing business alone with Trump. Note that Macron, to a large extent, was eclipsed by the German Chancellor, who's taken the sort of lead role as the leading spokesperson for the European coalition of the willing. So Macron, I suppose, is looking for a way to reestablish his leadership in this process. But I think it's positive because Putin has been signaling very strongly this week that he's not prepared to make any concessions, strong talk about, a return of historical lands, and that there are these, what did he call them, piglets in Europe that are messing things up in his very positive, constructive relations and talks with Trump. So the process is still very far from reaching a conclusion, but at least now Europe's more active role and commitment now, not just in words, but in finances and in weapons, is making an impact both on Washington and on Moscow.
Okay. Interesting point you made there also, as you said rightly, I think it was during his 4.5-hour-long speech to Russia, Putin dismissed the Europeans, calling them piglets, sort of very much not really the kind of wording that really takes the other side seriously. But given what you've said with Emmanuel Macron trying to find some sort of applying genuine pressure, how much leverage does he really have? I mean, he's domestically constrained. And also interesting point you raised about that, let's call it slight competition perhaps with the German Chancellor on this. How do these two factors play in?
Look, in tandem, I think they're more effective. But Macron also sat on the fence in the talks in Brussels over what to do with the seized or Russian assets. He didn't commit himself right until the end. He said a deal has been reached. But as commentators have noted, he didn't make it clear whether he would go for option A or option B. And in the end, he said, OK, we've got a deal. And there was a feeling that he'd let the side down by not coming out more firmly and supporting Merz's position, the German Chancellor's position, that, these Russian assets should be used and not a loan from the European nations themselves. Mm-hmm. So I think that there is some friction and tension there. But on the other hand, there should be some sort of little opening, shall we say, from Europe to Moscow so that messages can be sent. And of course, if Macron had been in the Kremlin's bad books until recently as number one culprit, together with the British Prime Minister and, of course, the Poles. Now I think it's the number one enemy is for Moscow is Germany and the German Chancellor. Mm-hmm. So therefore, it makes sense for Macron to carry the messages, as long as it's done in some kind of, shall we say, harmonious way.
Yeah, but isn't that sort of contradiction? I mean, if now one major leader is able to talk to Putin, but then there's the other. I mean, it was always about this united front of the Europeans together. And it seems there was a lot of criticism on Viktor Orban for visiting Mr. Putin on a few occasions. And now Macron can have that dialogue, but Germany can't. Or I mean, it sounds a bit fragmented. What's that going to be ultimately meaning for European policy towards Putin?
Well, it depends what Macron's going to say. If Macron is going to, project some kind of softer line, then obviously it's destabilizing for the rest of the alliance or coalition of the willing. But if he's going to take a firm message on behalf of all of his colleagues and all of those countries, then I don't think that does any harm. It's a question of, staying true to the collective position of the group rather than doing something unilaterally.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's talk about the group as a whole, and I'm talking about these last few days in Miami. We've had Steve Witkoff and his team and Jared Kushner also meeting the Ukrainian side, and also meeting the Russian side and the Europeans. I mean, we're hearing that once again, constructive meetings, everything's very positive. Where do we stand next, really? We've heard that kind of talk before. What can we concretely expect with some very different messaging coming from Mr. Ushakov in Russia, dismissing this whole thing entirely? So where are we headed with this in your mind?
Well, Kyiv Post had its own correspondent there at the talks. We have a correspondent at the State Department, and he was in Miami, and he reported today, and we have it in Kyiv Post, that the semblance of movement and of a closing of positions between Ukraine and the US is happening, with Europe involved this time and not just US-Ukraine. But the Russians going to Miami supposedly happy that they would be talking to the Americans again. But by the end of the weekend, they were very upset with Europe's attitude during the week, and were criticizing Europe for, shall we say, messing things up and not allowing the US-Russian element to dominate. So we came out with kind of mixed signals. The US and the Ukrainians were saying, good, we're moving forward. We're still talking about, the process rather than a substance. Whereas the Russians were saying the whole effort is effectively being scuttled by the Europeans, by their messing. They just leave it to the US and Russia to solve this, and we don't really need the Europeans to complicate matters.
And do you think that kind of message is going to come and resonate with Donald Trump? But what's he going to do next? I mean, it's a difficult one to predict what he does next. But if the Russians say we don't want the Europeans involved, how does that impact the next stage of all this?
Well, as you say, Trump is so unpredictable. The thing is, he's under a lot of pressure at home. He has to deliver on something. He's under pressure not just from the Epstein case and the economy's performance and a whole range of factors. And he also is under strong criticism within Congress too, for not being firm enough and not moving with sanctions against Russia to the extent that wouldn't have an impact. So he has to deliver something, and I'm sure that some of his advisors, it won't be Vance, for example, but it could be Rubio or even Witkoff saying, look, the Russians aren't giving. They're not ready to concede. You've heard what Putin's been saying in the last few days. There's no signal there. There's no sign that they are going to meet you halfway, Donald. So what do? I mean, we have to look good. We've got midterm elections coming up next year. We've got to somehow show that we're standing up for America.
Mm-hmm. I know it's also a tough one, and I know we've spoken before, and this is the, I guess, billion-dollar question. What are we going to see in 2026? I mean, in your experience, what's the most plausible in the next few weeks, even if we can call it that? Is that some kind of a ceasefire? Is that going to be a genuine peace? Is it going to be a frozen conflict? Where do you see, let's see, the winds currently carrying us if we look through the new year?
I think the winds are carrying us towards a frozen conflict, a kind of, if you want, South Korean scenario. What is positive is that several of the European countries are signaling that if a meaningful ceasefire is reached, that they would be prepared to send troops to monitor the ceasefire. I mean, the surprise of the week was not that the Portuguese were offering this, but even the Swiss was saying that they would be willing to take part, perhaps in a peacekeeping mission, shall we say. So I don't see that the Russians are ready to give in any substantial way, unless their economy keeps taking a literal pounding from Ukrainian drone attacks on strategic sites, particularly, the oil and gas.
Yeah, so on all that note, I'll have to jump in there, unfortunately. I mean, it is strategic, and there's many, many different factors. But look, we'll have to close it there, unfortunately, see where the new year takes us. Bohdan Nahaylo there, Frank, really appreciate it, always, your insights. Thank you so much. And thank you for watching. That concludes World Talks, but stay right here on TVP World for more. Bye-bye.